Thank you all for coming out, braving the weather, whether it was the snow and ice or avoiding going out sunbathing in the 35 Bond degrees we have today. Thank you all for coming out. My name is Chris Pupke. I am from Queen Anne's County with deep family roots going back to 1659 in what was at some points Talbot County, but is today Queen Anne's County. And I feel particularly welcome here at the Talbot County Library because my grandmother was a Talbot County librarian in the late 50s and 1960s. So it is very nice to be here. And thanks to Kayla and the staff and Peggy at the Talbot County Historical Society for having me. Today I'm going to talk about the United States Colored Troops from Queen Anne's County. The United States Colored Troops are the free and enslaved African Americans who fought in the Union Army during the Civil War. I will use the acronym USCT regularly throughout the talk, and that is for the United States Colored Troops. These are my sources. The Maryland State Archives are a great source. They have a page on, or not a whole section on their website on the legacy of slavery. And one of the things that they focused on there was Queen Anne's County, and the USCT from Queen Anne's County is a great resource. Also, deeds of manumission at Queen Anne's County Courthouse. You could also walk across the street and get them at the Talbot County Courthouse, but they've packed them up, scanned them, and shipped them off to Annapolis in deep storage. So now you have to go on your computer to get them. But if you've got a deed, if you own property, if you have a mortgage, you've recorded a deed at the courthouse. They did the same thing with people in these days. And when you manumitted someone, when you set them free, you recorded a deed of manumission. And for the USCT, that can be a great pathway to find these individuals. Military service records and pension records, fold3.com is a great resource. There's some books out there, including one that the Maryland State Legislature put together in the 1890s, History and Roster of Maryland Volunteers, the War of 1861 to 65. Notice it's volume 2. Even though these heroes fought and died for their country, even in the 1890s, 30 years, 25 years after the Civil War, they're still segregated. Volume 1 was for the white troops, Volume 2 was for the black troops. And then about 5 or 6 years into my work on doing research, I came upon a book by Mildred Schock, who did a lot of work on Kent Island, and a lot of work in Queen Anne's County history. And she had put together a book on the USCT from Queen Anne's County, and I found that very helpful. It would have been great if I could have gotten that book 5 years before, because there was a lot of repeated work, but so be it. I got it, and it was very helpful, and it would be a great resource for anybody doing this work. 1860, population of Queen Anne's County is about 16,000 people. Slightly under half of that population is African American, over 7,500. Of those 7,500, 4,200 were enslaved, but there were almost 3,400 who were free African Americans. Almost 20%, a little bit more than 20% of the population of Queen Anne's County at this time, at the dawn of the Civil War, was comprised of free African Americans. And it is the enslaved males and the free African American males from which we get our population of the United States Colored Troops. So what was life like for these individuals living in slavery before the Civil War? Let me read this piece to you. It comes from the Mohawk Courier, and it is a reprint of a piece from the Baltimore Sun, and it is about the funeral of a woman who was enslaved by Judge Richard Tillman Earl of Winton near Centerville. Let me read it to you. Let me know what you think of it. Burial of a faithful servant. Those at the North and East who are ignorant of our customs and institutions, or if conversant with, willfully misrepresent them, should have seen a few days ago the internment of an aged and infirm female, the property of Judge Earl. This old creature had for years been domesticated with the family of the judge, and as age and infirmity approached, was supplied with those comforts and indulgences which are the peculiar privileges of the aged servants of the South. And then from there they go on and talk about the Judge Earl's family members who were there, and so on and so forth, and what a wonderful day it was. And we look at this and we see comforts, indulgences, and privileges, and we think of the land of pleasant living and how wonderful it was. But there's something missing in this story. When we look at it, we get Judge Earl's name, we get two of his son-in-laws, two Tillmans, and then we get his three sons' names. But there's something missing. Her name, right? They feel so good about what they're doing, they just have completely forgotten about her. So maybe this is a little bit of an alarm bell, and this comes after the Nate Turner rebellions in Virginia, and they're trying to make slavery look better, so they put this kind of fake news out there. So, where can we turn for a better sense of what's going on? Well, we can turn to slave narratives, and here we have the narrative of the life of J.D. Green, Jacob Green, a runaway slave from Kentucky. We can learn a lot about what slavery was like and the conditions that these people lived under, even from an individual who was enslaved from Kentucky. But we're lucky in Queen Anne's County because this account contains an account of his three escapes, 1839, 46, and 48. And it is 1839 in particular that we're interested in because who did he escape from in 1839? Judge Richard Tillman Earl. Okay? And he escaped from Centerville about 1839, but got caught a couple of years later in New Jersey and was sold south. His story is a fascinating tale, and it is worthy of Hollywood producer getting their hands on. It includes jumping off a steamship in Lake Erie outside of Cleveland, and finally getting his freedom in 1848, sailing across Lake Ontario and making it to Toronto. But when he was 10 years old, his mother came up to him and asked him to pray for her and for him, because she had just been sold to a slave trader, and he would never see her again. He would grow up, get married, have children of his own. And one day he was sent on an errand into Centerville. Winton is out on Corsica Neck. If you know Pioneer Point, where the Russian embassy was before Obama took it away after the election of 2016, it's that property, that very property. It's about 4 to 5 miles outside of town. He was sent in to do an errand, came back, and found out that his wife and children had been sold away, and he would never see them again. That's what life was like for these individuals. It was very difficult. Green also talks of rape and murder, people being sold away, being treated like property. So, background on the USCT. African Americans began to fight in the Union Army after the Militia Act of 1862. If you've seen the movie Glory with Denzel Washington, Morgan Freeman, that's the Massachusetts 54th. That is a state militia. That is not part of the USCT. Very similar, but it is a state group, not a national, not a federal group. The Emancipation Proclamation Lincoln issued permitted the enlistment of black men into the United States Army and Navy, and General Order Number 143 in May of 1863 established the Bureau of Colored Troops. Slave owners received a bounty for enlistment. So if we're talking about reparations, remember that families like mine, we've got reparations from slavery already. We got reparations from the federal government at the end of the Civil War. At the end of the war, there were about 180,000 USCT enlisted in the Union Army, and that comprised about 10% of the Union force, and about 8,700 USCT served from Maryland. What about Queen Anne's County in particular? We don't have an exact number. I think getting an exact number is probably impossible because it depends on the definition of are you from Queen Anne's County or not, and as you move back and forth and are dragged back and forth and taken back and forth, it can be difficult to identify exactly where you're from. The Maryland State Archives has a list of 20 USCT soldiers on their site. That figure by some has been taken to mean that Queen Anne's County has 20 USCT veterans from it. That is incorrect. That was never meant to be a precise number. It was meant to be representative. I have identified over 475 USCT from Queen Anne's County, and this probably undercounts the African Americans who fought for the Union, because I've identified many of them by looking through the deeds of manumission. They were recruited in late summer, early fall of 1863 by Colonel William Birney, who was an abolitionist from the state of Alabama, of all places. And he came into Queen Anne's County. He also came to Talbot County and recruited folks to serve. And it's a very bold picture here. Some of the things to look at is they're dressed well, no holes in the clothes, they've got nice shoes on, but there is one feature in this poster that would have gone through society like a rocket ship in terms of getting people's attention. What is it about this image that would...
Weapons?
Yeah, they're armed. They're all armed, right? They've got their rifles right with them. And that would have scared some people and emboldened others.
And Chris,
yes.
Drummer Boy.
The drummer boy. Okay, the other thing, the drummer boy. What's interesting about the drummer boy is just this past week, I encountered a photograph of this image. It is almost precise to this image, with one exception. The drummer boy was not in the photograph. So the artist added the drummer boy after the photograph was taken. But yes, there are many instances of young African Americans going in and serving as drummer boys.
And he was one of the first to be shot at because he was the communication system.
Right. The flag bearer, the drummer boys would be shot at early because they were flag bearers, and drumming were two ways to communicate. Let people know where to go, when to go, how to go. Okay, recruitment was dangerous. This is part of the military record of Benjamin Brown. He's 22 years old. He's from Queen Anne's County, where he was a farmer. And in the remarks down at the bottom, shot while on recruiting service at Greensboro, Maryland, March 10th, 1864. So it was dangerous. Greensboro is in Caroline County, maybe 25 miles from Easton or so. The town is still there. And Mr. Brown went there trying to get more USCT troops, and somebody in the county said, "Not in my backyard," and they shot him. And I'm very sorry to say that on March 11th, Private Brown succumbed to his injuries. It was also dangerous for the women. This is actually John Johnson, up at the top, served in Company A, the 7th Regiment. He's from Talbot County, and he was a sailor. And this is from the pension record of his wife, Harriet. Harriet lived in Unionville, and this document is dated 1871, and I'll read it to you here, starting right about there. And forgive me for sticking my nose in my computer, but it's tough to read this script. The females persuaded their husbands, brothers, and sons that were competent to take up arms in defense of the government against the rebels. After the men left, we women were tied up and flogged for persuading them to go. So it was not only dangerous for the men, but it was dangerous for the women as well.
What does it mean in the complexion?
Okay.
What is that?
The complexion is for the skin color, and usually it's black. Sometimes it's mulatto. In the case of a griff, G-R-I-F-F, complexion means that you had one grandparent who was a white individual. So a black person and a mulatto have offspring, and that person is griff. That's how important, this is an interesting side note, that's how important race was at this time, to delineate that far down the line, what it was. When you look at the military records of the Continental Army in the Revolutionary War, you don't see race mentioned hardly at all. Race became much, much more important over those 90 years. Okay. This is what they would risk their lives for, the men and the women. The women telling their men to go, and the men serving. It's a deed of manumission for George Washington Gibbs. It's difficult to read, but it's there. And if you look closely, you can see his name, George Washington Gibbs. Deed of manumission and release of service for serving in the 19th Regiment of the Colored Troops in the services of the United States. That's what was worth risking their lives for, freedom. This is an image of Company E of the 4th Regiment I've only identified a handful, 1, 2, or 3 individuals from Queen Anne's County that served in 4th Regiment. I suspect there are more. I suspect that there are a number from Talbot County, so whether any of these are some of our hometown heroes, I don't know, but that's what they would have looked like. This is a good representation. Again, the startling feature, they're armed. So from Queen Anne's County, I've identified about 477 plus or minus USCT. I think that is an undercount. I think the real number is probably somewhere about 600. It's relatively easy to find them when I'm looking in the 7th, the 19th, and the 39th regiments, because they come up pretty regularly. But then you have, I think it's 150 USCT regiments, 180, something like that. And when you start getting down to some of these that have 1, 2, or 3, it's a lot more difficult to find them. We're going to focus today on the 7th, the 19th, and the 39th, because that is where the majority of these individuals from Queen Anne's County come. The 7th USCT Regiment was recruited from Maryland in the fall of 1863. It included probably more than 160 individuals from Queen Anne's County. They trained at Camp Stanton in Charles County, Maryland. They fought on the barrier islands from Hilton Head to Jacksonville, and as we'll see at the Battle of Chaffin's Farm. So if you know that barrier islands, Hilton Head, and Jacksonville, that area, think of the movie Glory again. Denzel Washington, Morgan Freeman, the climactic battle scene at the end, where you're charging across that empty beach to a fort with all these troops shooting at you, all the artillery shooting at you. Think about the bravery it took to do that. During the war, they performed so well that they were reviewed by General Grant and President Lincoln. This is part of the military record for Richard Gibbs, who was enslaved near Centerville. He was a private in Company D, 7th Regiment, United States Colored Troops, killed in action, September 29, 1864, Fort Gilmer, Virginia. Okay, so 7th USCT fought at the Battle of Chaffin's Farm, in particular at Fort Gilmer, September 29, 1864. The goal was Richmond. At this point, Grant and Lee were locked in that deadly fight, the overland campaign, and every time they would hit, Grant would bounce off and go a little bit south into the east, south into the east, south into the east. Wilderness, Spotsylvania Courthouse, Cold Harbor, etc. Eventually, Grant is actually south of Richmond, near Petersburg, and Grant has set up his line to stop Grant from going north to take Richmond. And so here we are, we've got the USCT and other federal Union troops trying to push through these troops south of Petersburg and push north to take Richmond. Fort Gilmer that day at the Battle of Chaffin's Farm presented a major obstacle, and the Union Army sent 2 regiments of light troops that failed to capture the fort. That was about 1,400 men. The U.S. military, never tiring of a bad idea, thought, well, let's try it again. But this time, they sent, instead of 2 regiments, they only sent 4 companies. So instead of about 1,400 men, they sent about 250 men. All right? We start doing the math. And then if we take a look at this image, this is Fort Gilmer from around the time of the battle. A couple things to note and a couple things that aren't there that you don't see. One, look at the trench. That's probably well over their head. So if you go down, it's a straight fall. And you got to get back up to get back to your lines. You got these earthworks. You got very open ground out there. And what you don't see are all the soldiers with their rifles and all of the artillery that's aimed on them. So what became of these men, these heroes? Well, here's part of the report from Colonel James Shaw, who was the commander of the 7th USCT that day. Let me read it to you. I was directed to send out 4 companies of skirmishers to storm Fort Gilmer. Companies C, D, G, and K were designated for this purpose. Captain Julius A. Weiss, the senior captain in command. Deploying these companies, Captain Weiss proceeded steadily to the front. under a heavy artillery fire, and as he approached the works, charged into the very trenches, but was unable to get further. Not a man faltered, but all who did not fall reached the work, charged boldly, and did all in their power to take it. So what came of these men who charged boldly, who did not falter, who tried all in their power to take the fort? What became of these heroes? Colonel Shaw concludes, they are all missing. They are all missing. These heroes made that desperate charge, fought bravely, boldly. They are all missing. I hear and read a statement like that. Curious mind, I want to see what he means by they are all missing. Casualty rates at the 54th Massachusetts, for example, at Fort Wagner, the culminating battle at the end of glory, they had 50% casualty rates. Pickett's charge at Gettysburg, again, about 50%. These were devastating attacks. Devastating to have a 50% casualty rate. So what did the 4 companies from the 7th USCT encounter? Well, my research, I looked and found 36 USCT from Queen Anne's County who were present in companies C and D of the 7th USCT at that time of the charge on Fort Gilmer. I maintain that 5 of those did not charge, a drummer, a bugler, 2 cooks, and a sharpshooter. So I think about 31 men from Queen Anne's County made the charge that day. What became of them? How many casualties? 8 were killed in action. 3 would die of their wounds shortly thereafter. 4 were wounded in action. 13 became prisoners of war. 9 of those POWs died in prisoner of war camp in Salisbury, North Carolina. A total of 28 casualties. I can find 3 men who charged and returned unscathed. A casualty rate of 90%. Much greater than many of the worst and best known instances of high casualties during the Civil War. Here's one member of Company D of the USCT 7th Regiment who was wounded at Fort Gilmer, John Kennard. Next time you go across the Bay Bridge, just before you reach the overpass, the last overpass, Route 8 on Kent Island, steal a look to your left, you'll see a target. Take away the target, make it the cornfield it was 40 years ago, and look on out past that to the water, down towards the Kent Manor Inn. This is the property that Mr. Kennard was enslaved on. And when you look at his military record, you can see that he was wounded, sent to the hospital, September 29th, 1864. And later on in his record, we see that he had a gunshot fracture on his right thigh. So he had a gunshot that hit his right leg that broke his thigh, and unfortunately, he died in his hospital on October 14th, lingering for over 2 weeks in the hospital and dying. So this is what happened to Private Kennard, a hero that day, died of wounds taken at Fort Gilmer, charging that boldly into the very trenches of the fort. But if you look at this, there's more information here that bears looking at. And that is, on this piece of paper, the bottom half is an inventory of his effects. He had 1 pair of trousers, 1 pair of shoes. He did not have any boots, he did not have any blankets or knapsacks or canteens, he didn't have a hat, didn't have an overcoat or a jacket. John Kennard did not have a shirt. Remember, he was enslaved when he got into the Army. This is what he has to his name: a pair of pants and a pair of shoes. John Kennard could not give you the shirt off his back, but he could sacrifice his life for this country. These are the kind of men that we want to honor. Bring it here to Talbot County very quickly. Benjamin Blackwell served in Company C of the USCT, the 7th Regiment. I think my microphone is going in and out, so I'm going to try to switch real quick. Is that any better? Yeah, that's better. He was born in Talbot County. He was a farmer. Talbot County, in his military records right here, a farmer. And he was wounded at the Battle of Chapin's Farm and died September 29th, 1864, of wounds received in action at Chapin's Farm. That is Fort Gilmer. On to the 19th USCT Regiment. It was organized at Camp Stanton again in December, a little bit later than the 7th Regiment. Men mostly from the Eastern Shore and Southern Maryland, including more than 146 from Queen Anne's County. This microphone is not working either. All right, let's see how much better I can get with this. Okay, I've identified 146 men from Queen Anne's County who served in the USCT 19th Regiment. They were active again in the Overland Campaign and the Siege of Petersburg in 1864. They played a prominent role at the Battle of the Crater on July 30th, 1864, and they were at the end of the war among the first troops to enter Richmond on April 3rd, 1865. Jacob Haith, who lived on Kent Island, again, near the Safeway on Kent Island. He was born free. His brother was killed during the Civil War. He served in the 19th USCT. After the war, he moved to Baltimore, where he was a shoemaker and owned his own house. But you can see in the remarks that he was free on or before April 18th, 1861. April 18th, 1861 is Fort Sumter. James Bond, Company C of the 19th USCT, enslaved near Centerville, enlisted in December of 1863 in the 19th Regiment. He was immediately made a sergeant. They saw something in him. He had a certain something of leadership ability. We can read all about him. He was 24 years old. He was from Queen Anne's County, a farmer. And he was killed in action July 30th, 1864 at the Battle of the Mine. The Battle of the Mine is also known as the Battle of the Crater. Battle of the Crater, again, Grant is trying to go north through Petersburg to reach Richmond. Lee has set up a line to block him. Some Pennsylvania soldiers look at the high ground that the Confederate troops are occupying. They're miners, and they say, I got a great idea. Let's dig a hole, dig a mine, get underneath their position, blow up the mine, exploit that gap, and make our way on into Richmond. USCT trained for weeks, and they were trained that as soon as that explosion goes, you go immediately and you go around the hole, the crater that's created. Immediately and go around. One more time, immediately and go around. But at the last minute, leadership in the Union Army substituted white troops for the USCT, and that led to a disaster. The USCT were removed, and they were back up. They were support troops. They're about a mile off the line. They hear the mine blow up at about 4:45 in the morning. The mine goes boom, and there's a huge gap created in Lee's line, something that's ready to be exploited. And they know, as soon as they hear that, they're waiting, go immediately and go around. And they're waiting, they're listening for action, they're listening for gunfire, they're listening for cheers, they're listening for bugles, drums, whatever it is, they're listening. They don't hear anything. And they wait for 1 minute, nothing. 2 minutes, 5 minutes, nothing. Go immediately, go around, they're thinking. And about 10 minutes later, finally, they start moving, and they hear that the battle has been engaged, but they know by that point that the initiative has been lost, and that Lee has been filling that gap in his line, and that the day is going to be much more difficult than they had anticipated. In fact, not only did the white troops wait, what else did they do? They didn't go around, they went right into the crater. So the whole thing was a mess. Grant called it the sorriest affair he ever saw. The USCT would be sent in to try and fix things up and to extract the white troops. The white troops leader, by the way, was back behind the line in his tent, drinking whiskey during this whole thing. Real leadership. But when the USCT got in there, that's when things really went bad. A massacre occurred, perhaps the greatest massacre in the Civil War. One historian, Bryce Sudrow, calculated that the typical wounded to dead ratio on a battlefield during the Civil War was 4.81 wounded for every 1 dead. The Battle of the Crater with the USCT regiments, the ratio was 1.7 wounded to 1 dead. So we're missing 3 wounded for every 1 dead. Where are those men? Where are those wounded? Well, they were slaughtered. And we know this from first-hand accounts, including from the 30th USCT, a veteran from the 30th USCT talked about it. Some of the Confederate troops bragged about it. To their credit, some of the Confederate troops were horrified and wrote home how terrible their fellow troops in the Confederacy behaved that day. Colonel William Pegram, Confederate artillerist, wrote, "I think over 200 USCT got into our lines to surrender. I don't believe that much over half of these ever reached the rear. You could see them lying dead all along the route to the rear. These are men who have surrendered, hands up, they're not armed, and literally going to the rear to surrender and being shot at, being attacked, assaulted, and killed and murdered." The 39th USCT, they're organized a little bit later in the war. March of 1864, I found more than 128 from Queen Anne's County. They fought again in the Overland Campaign. They fought at the Battle of the Crater on July 30th, 1864, and they reinforced General Sherman's troops prior to the capture of General Joseph E. Johnston's Confederate Army on April 26th, 1865. A lot of times we think of Lee surrendering to Grant as being the real end of hostilities during the war. But even after Lee surrendered, General Johnston had a Confederate army running around the Carolinas, and there was great concern about what would become of those troops. And the 39th USCT was there when they finally surrendered. Here's a photograph of the field staff of the 39th Regiment. Notice that the field staff, all white, but in the background we do have some of our heroes. They, about 6 USCT. I'd need a mathematician to tell me what the odds are about whether one of those was from Queen Anne's County or Talbot County or not. We've got about 15% of the regiment are from Queen Anne's County, and we've got 6 guys. I'm not going to be able to tell you what the math is, but maybe one of those guys is from Queen Anne's County or Talbot County. Certainly they're most likely from Maryland. And the gentleman I like to talk about from Queen Anne's County who served in the 39th Regiment, Company K, is James Taylor. I knew his granddaughter very well. He was born enslaved near Centerville, 1843 roughly. He did not know his mother's name. Take a moment to consider that. He did not know his mother's name. His father was Phil Taylor, who may have helped found New Life Community Church. If you've been to Centerville, just as you come from Easton, going north on 213, the road splits, and there's a Citgo gas station right there. The church that his father founded, New Life Community Church, sits right behind that gas station. After the war, he worked as a sexton at St. Paul's Church in Centerville, proud member there. And with the help of our former rector, who's in the back row, we've got a nice plaque up at St. Paul's in honor of the roughly 64 individuals. It's like we're getting ready for the Olympics, passing the flag. Thank you. We've got a plaque up at St. Paul's for the 64 individuals from that parish that were enslaved and later served in the United States Colored Troops. I'm grateful for that. He owned a house on Commerce Street, if you know where the Wye River Upper School is in Centerville. It's just 2 doors down from that. And he was married by the rector of St. Paul's in 1867. And he is buried there in Chesterfield Cemetery, right by the Citgo. You can almost see the Citgo. Well, you can see the Citgo if you were to turn to the right. It's not far from the center of the cemetery. After the war, many moved to Baltimore. Some did return to Queen Anne's County. Looking at the census of 1890, you can find some of the individuals from Queen Anne's County that served, that remain in the county. And after the war, some of their activities included searching for family members, building churches, buying property, establishing schools, and unfortunately for them, but fortunately for us historians, they had to do a lot of paperwork. Without that paperwork, we wouldn't have all this great information on them. Okay, here's an example. This comes from a Philadelphia paper. It's individuals searching for their family and allow me to read it to you. Information wanted of my father, Felix Ringgold. He was sold when I was a small boy. By the way, if they tell you they didn't split up families, don't believe them, they did. And here's proof of one of them. I had 2 brothers and 1 sister when he was sold. William Henry, Alexander, and Sarah Ringgold. My sister was a baby at the time. My mother's name is Betsy Ringgold. She was owned by a man named Jacob W. Legg of Kent Island. My father was sold by a man named John Bright of Kent Island. Any information of his whereabouts will be gladly received by his son, the Reverend Samuel E. Ringgold. So there are hundreds, if not thousands, of these kinds of ads in newspapers looking for family members. Alexander Ringgold, by the way, would serve in the 19th Regiment of the USCT. I don't know whether they ever found their father or not, unfortunately. They also built churches. Ryan's United Methodist Church in Graysonville. This is New Life Methodist Church, the one that James Taylor's family helped establish. And here's one up in Pondtown, Mount Pleasant. That's up near Crumpton, at the north end of the county. And they have a cemetery in the back of the church, and they've got 1 USCT member buried there, John Pruitt, Company C, the 19th Regiment, and Jimmy Brown would be upset with me if I didn't mention that Bryan's is a cemetery. And right about there, Charles Hazelton of the 19th USCT is buried, and back about over that way through the church, James R. Smith, the 7th USCT is buried. These churches served many purposes in the community. They were a faith community. They provided business connections and tie-ins. Beneficial societies. These are kind of like what we think of more as an insurance organization today. Health insurance, life insurance, that kind of thing. It is an area that merits great scholarship, and an area that needs more awareness and knowledge, and there's a lot of paperwork out there to dig into it. They also serve as education facilities. I'm going to read this to you. Don't worry, don't strain your eyes. But this is a plea from a man named Charles Watkins to the Freedmen's Bureau, which was established by the United States government after the war to help African Americans transition to a post-slavery economy. And I know that this image is terrible, but I spent 8 hours in the National Archives in the bowels digging through the archives to find it. So here it is. I'm putting it up there because I found it. And then I'm also putting it up there to remind myself when I spend 8 hours and I pull 30 different microfilm pieces, when you leave the archives, circle the one that you finally found the document in, so when you get home, you can properly cite it. Because if I have to go back, I'm going to have to spend another 8 hours to find it because I didn't put a little circle or a star next to it. All right, be that as it may, I found this not in any piece on local history, not in a piece on Maryland history, or even in national history. I found it in the United Nations report called The Slave Visions and Aspirations and Hopes of Slaves and Former Slaves. There's a letter from Mr. Watkins near Centerville to the Freedmen's Bureau. And it reads, near Centerville, Queen Anne's County, Maryland, March 13, 1866. General, I hope you will pardon me for addressing this letter to you, General, but we do not know who else to look to but you. Our case, sir, is this. The returned colored soldiers are in many cases beaten and their guns taken from them. We dare not walk out in the evening. If we do, and we are met by some of these rowdies that were in the rebel army, they beat us badly, and sometimes shoot us. On last Wednesday evening, the 7th, our colored school teacher was collared and beaten. He got loose and ran and was shot at. The party was 6 white men. And on Sunday evening, the 11th, some persons we think 2 in number came on horseback to our church about 11 o'clock p.m. and set fire to the church that we keep school in and burnt it to the ground. Now, sir, this is the way we get our freedom. Can you do anything for us? For God's sake, do it. We do not know where to go for safety. I am, General, your obedient servant, Charles A. Watkins. So this was part of the earliest efforts at public education for African Americans in Queen Anne's County. One of 3 schools founded in October of 1865 in the Centerville area. And it was received so well in the community that they burned it to the ground. But this is a resilient community, and if you go out to Burrsville and go look behind Mount Zion Church and look at their parish hall, this is an old one-room schoolhouse that stands and was one of the buildings that replaced that church that they burnt to the ground to serve as some of their places for education. I've given this talk and had people say, I went to school in that building. That's exciting. Once they left that school, they would go to Kennard, African American High School. It's today Kennard African American Cultural and Heritage Center in Centerville. It's the former Kennard High School. It was built in 1936. Franklin Delano Roosevelt and the New Deal were instrumental in getting it built. And today, it's no longer a school, but it is a center and a museum and a wonderful place to visit. I encourage you all to go out and take a look. They have some good exhibits on United States colored troops there. So what was the legacy of the United States colored troops? Abraham Lincoln is quoted as saying, without the military help of the black freedmen, the war against the South could not have been won. So let's think about what that means. They win the war, end slavery, and preserve the Union. That's a great legacy. Winning the war, preserving the Union, ending slavery, something to be very proud of, something that we ought to honor and recognize, something that has literally been taken out of the history books and needs to go back into the history books. It has been beaten out of the history books, quite literally beaten out of the history books. It needs to go back in. But I think there's a fourth thing that they also proved, and a part of their legacy that we ought to recognize and honor. And ironically enough, I think the best way to exemplify that legacy is by quoting Hal Cobb. Hal Cobb was a former governor of the state of Georgia, Speaker of the United States House of Representatives, and served as Treasury Secretary under President Buchanan. At the end of the war, he was actually one of the first, he was a founding father of the Confederacy. He was the first president of the Confederacy. He was the one who swore in Jefferson Davis. So this is a muckety-muck in the Confederacy. And at the end of the war, as the Confederacy is losing and it's looking like a desperate cause, people are talking about what they can do to turn the table, turn the tides, and some people suggest, let's arm the slaves. Hal Cobb did not like that idea, and he said, if slaves make good soldiers, our whole theory of slavery is wrong. And Mr. Cobb, you're right. Your whole theory of slavery is wrong. The racist ideas of the past, and we hope they're in the past, right? Maybe not. Those racist ideas, they were dead wrong. And these men proved it every day serving their country in the Army, in the Union Army during the Civil War. And over and over and over again, you read their military records, you get through their pension records, and you will see that these men are heroes, and they need to be recognized. One last one of them that I'd like to introduce you to is Private Robert Riley, Company B, the 7th Regiment, USCT. No, note, he's not Company C or D, or we probably would not have a photograph of him because he probably would have died at Fort Gilman. But he was born enslaved near Queenstown along the Wye River. His pension file includes a surgeon's report that talks about the scars from being whipped that are on his back. He helped found Earl's Chapel on Corsica River Neck. That is a church that just only in the last 30 years has gone away. I recently got the deed to that church, and I'm very happy to report Robert Riley was literate, even as being born a slave. He could read and write. He wrote his own signature on that deed, and it's really neat. The last thing I want to know is I mentioned how the 19th USCT were among the last troops to enter Richmond, among the first troops to enter Richmond at the end of the war, and the 39th were among the troops that helped corral General Johnston's army in the Carolinas in late April of '65. Robert Riley and the 7th USCT were present at Appomattox Courthouse when Lee surrendered to Grant. So when we look into that man's proud eyes, with his medal from the Grand Army of the Republic proudly placed on his chest, think about what he got to see. He got to see the whip come down on his back. He also got to see Lee surrender to Grant. He probably would have seen President Lincoln as he marched by when his troops, his regiment was reviewed by Lincoln. So these are the men that we want to recognize, and we need to honor and recognize these guys. Here's a monument to the USCT in Chestertown. You all probably in this audience know Unionville and the amazing work that's been done out there to recognize the USCT heroes there. Queen Anne's County, we have very, very little, almost nothing. Not quite nothing, but almost nothing in recognizing it. And we need to do something about that. And for about a decade, this is where my talk would end. About a year and a half ago, I gave this presentation to a group of veterans from Queen Anne's County. And somebody came up and said, well, why don't we do something about this? Why don't we work to recognize it? And from that came an effort to erect a statue at Kennard, African American Cultural and Heritage Center. And we are now working very hard within the community to raise funds for that statue. We've got 100,000 raised. We've got a good lead on some other funds. We've got more work to be done. There is some information in the back if you're interested in more information or if you want to make a donation. I've got some information on that back table. Please pick it up as you leave. If you have any questions, please let me know. This is an important initiative in Queen Anne's County to recognize the full breadth of contributions that African Americans made to our county, to our community. It has been ignored and forgotten. We have in Queen Anne's County about 30 of those historic signs, the silver and black ones that the state highway puts out along the roadways. There's one in front of the Talbot County Courthouse over here. We've got about 30 of those signs in Queen Anne's County. I think the number is 30. Only one of them mentions African Americans. Remember, right, at the beginning, we learned that about 48% of the population in 1860 was African American, right? So if there are 30 for white folks, why aren't there 30 for black folks? We're going to fix that. We're working on fixing that, and this is a beginning stage to that. So there is information back there. Please take a look at it, and if you can, please help support that effort. Now, any questions? Yes, sir.
Yes, the photo of Robert Riley there, is that the Congressional Medal of Honor?
That is the Medal of the Grand Army of the Republic. That was kind of basically a Union Civil War victory medal. There were a number of USCT who were awarded the Medal of Honor. I'm fairly certain there are none from Queen Anne's County. I don't know of any from either Kent or Queen Anne's. There was at least one from Annapolis area in Arundel County. But I don't think any from the mid-shore.
26 were awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor, and you can see all 26 at the National Museum of African American History and Culture in the military section in DC.
Okay, so that was 26 USCT were awarded the Medal of Honor. Thank you. Yes, ma'am. How did you get picked for a particular regiment? I think it was basic. I don't know the exact answer, but my observation suggests that it was a bit based on timing and location. where you were, when you got pulled in, that kind of thing.
And the ease of recruiting.
Ease of recruiting. Well, they kind of all tie in where you were at one time, and you just kind of got put in. You will see the vast majority from Queen Anne's County, I'm sure it's the same for Talbot, in the 7th enlisted in September of 1863, in the 19th USCT, they're all December of 1863, in the 39th, they're all March of 1864. Now that being said, there was often one company of just oddballs in each one of these regiments, and you go back to that slide where I had, 145 in the 7th, 150 in the 19th, 1 in the 29th. You had those oddballs stuck in every regiment. So it's difficult, but generally location, method of recruitment, and time. Yes.
Did those USCT troops get paid?
Did they get paid? That is a complicated question. They did. They did. If you remember from the movie Glory, one of the big scenes in the middle of the movie is the black troops found out that they were not going to get paid the same amount of money. In fact, I think the numbers are $13 a month for a white Union soldier, $10 a month for a black Union soldier. They would fight that effort and would get that pay lifted. And in fact, these are not only guys that are preserving the Union and ending slavery and winning the war. There's some of the first civil rights battles that they took too. They wanted equal pay. And there was a petition in La Ouverture, I'm not good at French, La Ouverture Hospital in Northern Virginia, where the white troops were getting buried at Arlington National Cemetery, and the black troops had their own segregated cemetery. And the black troops at the hospital said, no, we're not going to have any of that. And they signed, a couple of hundred of them signed a petition saying, we want regular treatment, we want to be treated equally. And I've identified a couple from Queen Anne's County who have signed that petition, and I can match their name, their signature, or their mark to their military record. Yes, sir.
Okay. So to caveat on that, I was reading letters of just correspondence when they were trying to recruit some of the colored troops. And is it true the slave owners were paid $300, and where the slave that was being soldier got nothing out of that? And can you talk a little bit about the complexity with recruiting? How much was morale and spirit versus how much was a sales pitch by white leaders?
Okay, now to start with the first part, $300 was an enlistment bonus that went to the soldier unless that soldier was enslaved. And then it went to the individual who enslaved them. And that's why when I said that when we look at reparations, families like mine, we got reparations for the Civil War, for slavery, because I have ancestors who received a $300 enlistment bonus for people that they had enslaved. Okay? Think about that when we have a conversation about reparations in Annapolis, because that's going to be coming up again in the coming weeks. And the second part of your question was about how recruitment went. My understanding, I'm not an expert on this particular field. If somebody else has something that they want to add, please do. It didn't take a lot of encouragement. They were ready to go. When given the opportunity, they just kind of left. There are stories that I've read from Wright's Neck in Centerville, an individual who was enslaved by the Wright family on Wright's Neck. And they woke up one morning and he wasn't there, and they didn't know what happened to him. And he just walked into town, down by that Citgo again. If you go by that Citgo, there's an open field just before it. That's where the African Americans gathered in September 1863 to get out and fight the war. So I think it was more, if they had the opportunity to fight, they took advantage of it.
And they ran to the blue line.
Right, and particularly in the South, if they were in the South, they would run and try and get enlisted. Yeah. And son of Talbot County, Frederick Douglass, was one of the individuals who really had to work and lobby Lincoln to allow them to fight in the Union Army. I think Douglas's phrase was that Lincoln was cold to the idea and very slow to the idea of allowing African Americans to fight in the Civil War. Eventually giving in and allowing it. And they made the difference. They may have really and truly been the difference in winning the war.
I think addressing the question about the recruitment of slaves, not free blacks, but of slaves, it was a question of $300 went to mostly to slave owners who were friendly or who were unionist slave owners and not secessionist slave owners. So there was a problem with secessionists getting anything because they were fighting the Union. And if they were, and everybody knew who everybody else was, so it wasn't really a problem figuring out which slave owners had sons of the Confederacy and which ones had, were supporting the Union. So that entered into it. And of course, there was a lot of give and take, a lot of arguing. Lincoln was involved, and they kept hammering it out and discussing it. And that was basically what it came down to. If you were a unionist, you pretty much got the money easily. If not, they had to struggle for it. And it was always a heavily disputed issue. And it's important to remember, an awful lot of slave owners were, by 1864, anxious to sell their slaves to the Union and get their compensation. Because slavery was, they knew, was gone down the tubes anyway in Maryland. They would get nothing for their slaves. So they anxiously tried to get the $300, because that would be the only compensation they could get.
To that point, you had to record, excuse me, a deed of manumission to get the $300 payment. And when you look at these deeds of manumission recorded at the Queen Anne's County Courthouse, 2/3 of them are after Lee surrendered. Okay? So 2/3 of them, talk about your lost cause, right? I don't think he's coming back. Let's see if we can get $300, right? So it's after Lee surrenders that 2/3 of them get it. I have only found one individual in Queen Anne's County who was turned down for their enlistment bonus. A woman by the name of Mary Davis, I think she was a Tillman. She was turned down, but her son would later get the $300 for that individual. And it's recorded she was disloyal during the war, and so they rejected it. So you had to prove that you were loyal. It sounds to me, from my research, not comprehensive, just incidental to Queen Anne's County, it sounds like that was a lower bar than we would like to think it was. Mary?
Do you know if any of this information is taught in Queen Anne's County or Talbot County Public Schools?
I don't know about Talbot County, but I can say it's not in Queen Anne's County. I've tried to get it in there, but been unsuccessful. I'll leave it at that. I think it would be valuable to get it. I know that I've talked to any number of people who went and lived in Queen Anne's County all their life who didn't know it. My mother and my aunt went to Queen Anne's County schools, and they got out of college and found out about Frederick Douglass and Harriet Tubman, right? And that is, we still need to work on that for sure.
First of all, thank you. This is a fabulous presentation. And I say that to say, my name is Bernie Demchuk, and I'm on the board of directors of the African American Civil War Museum and Monument in Washington, D.C. And we're reopening in March of this year in a much bigger, excellent facility that has terrific exhibits. And we'd like to invite you to present at our museum some point, and of course invite all of you for our reopening. I'll certainly let Kayla know of all that information. My name is Bertie Demchuk, and I'm the one who wrote the book on Unionville, United States Colored Troops, and it's called Unionville, Race, Place, Time, and Memory in Talbot County, and it's in the Maryland room inside this library here. I say that to say that when you did the story of Mr. Watkins' plea, The St. Stephen's AME Church in Unionville was built in 1892. The reason is the 1871 church was burned to the ground by, we don't know who, but we think the Klan, because there was a Klan here and they were terrorizing Unionville in particular because Unionville was so successful. It was such an ideal community doing very well for itself that they burned the church down. Rebuilt in 1892. So I'll be around afterwards, and I have my contribution to your statue. And I encourage.
Like Bernie said, and Unionville is special in my heart. My name is Stephen Michael Milky, true story. Stephen comes from the name St. Stephen's Church. My sister gave it to me. We drove by it all the time. She liked the name. Unionville, one of the first times I ever heard, we drove through all the time, and Jack Daffin told me, he was born in 1904, he said, derisively they called it Coppelstown. First time I ever heard of that, before all this research was done. And on some old maps, you see it called Coppelstown. And of course, the Union troops who settled the town and the freemen, they were very proud of their Union heritage, and Unionville won out. Believe it or not, Topperville, something that hasn't even been researched, was founded, land given by Captain Benjamin Horney, who was very sympathetic. It was also founded by two Solomon the Shields of John Copper. Originally name was Liberty. The name didn't stick because the white sympathetic, still lost cause sympathy, never stuck. I never found that out until a few years ago. So there's still a lot of research to be done. In fact, we didn't even get that into our United States color. There's still more work to be done. Believe me, that a lot of this stuff is true to my heart. I hope some of you see my Facebook things on Copperville and Unionville that I share, and some of the pictures and stories, and Bernie has done a great job. But believe me, there's still a lot of research to be done, and the lost cause is still alive and well.
There's a lifetime of research to be done on these USCT for sure. And following up on your comment on Unionville and trying to kind of wipe that history away, they were successful in Queen Anne's County. If you drive up between Churchill and Chestertown, you'll see on the right Union Church Road. It's on your right, and that used to be a black church full of descendants of USCT, and it is gone. It's just gone. The church has been moved and converted to a house. The old schoolhouse, one-room schoolhouse that was there, has been converted into a residence. The cemetery is still active and alive, but everything else has been kind of wiped out, and that history is lost. Lost. Yes. Thank you all for coming out. Be careful on the way home.